the book of Job tells the story of a righteous man who, for all intents and purposes, was doing everything as God would have him to do it. And so why then does this incredible time of suffering enter his life? One of the things that we talked about last week is this idea of how can there be so much suffering in the world if God is a loving God, is one of the main hurdles that folks who have not yet embraced Christianity have to embracing Christianity. For them, it is a difficult hurdle to overcome because if God is truly this loving, gracious, kind God, then why would he allow suffering to exist in the world as he does? And then especially for someone like Job. But the reality of our existence is that bad things happen to nice people every day of the week. As a matter of fact, Sherry and I were in a conversation over the weekend about, she was telling us about one of the ladies that had spoken at the conference and how that a man's wife had been diagnosed with a genetic illness, and he was faithful to nurse his wife through that illness, took care of her for, 25 years? That he was faithful to do that, and after she ultimately passed away from the illness, and he was wonderfully introduced to a new woman in his life. They discovered that one of the two daughters that he had had with his first biological wife had the same disease that the wife had.
Wow.
And the specter is that they will face another 25 years of that kind of difficulty with this daughter. So there are questions like that, and Job deals with that issue. Job squarely takes on the idea of suffering in the world. Let's read together from Job chapter 1, and we're going to read down through verse 8. In the land of Uz there lived a man whose name was Job. This man was blameless and upright. He feared God and shunned evil. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters, and he owned 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 donkeys, and had a large number of servants. He was the greatest man among all the people of the East. Isn't that a remarkable statement? The greatest man of all the people of the East. His sons used to hold feasts in their homes on their birthdays, and they would invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. When a period of feasting had run its course, Job would make arrangements for them to be purified. Early in the morning, he would sacrifice a burnt offering for each of them, thinking, "Perhaps my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." This was Job's regular custom. One day the angels came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came with them. The Lord said to Satan, "Where have you come from?" Satan answered the Lord, "From roaming throughout the earth, going back and forth on it." Then the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil." Here is God. Here is black and white evidence of God throwing Job under the bus. There it is, right there. Okay? God describes Job as righteous. Now, we're not going to take the time like we did last week to read chapter 31, but if you want to see how righteous, take the time to read chapter 31. It's amazing. The things that Job was committed to are absolutely amazing. He was a very impressive person in terms of not only his own personal righteousness, but in the way he lived out his faith in his community. So here's Job minding his own business and doing a pretty good job of it. And God's the one that said so. And in verse 6, we see that there's a meeting in heaven. And the thing that we see there is, we won't take the time to go into a lot of the details of it, but the main thing that we see is here's Satan in heaven, and God asks him, what have you been doing? And what does Satan say that he has been doing? Going to and fro in all the earth, going back and forth in it. Okay? When I was reading this last week, it reminded me of, it's like the CEO who has all the information about his company at his fingertips, because he's been keeping his hands on what's going on, his finger on the pulse of what's going on. And so here's Satan going to and fro throughout the earth, watching what's going on. We related another passage to that, 1 Peter 5:8, where we are told by Peter, your adversary the devil, as a roaring lion, goes about seeking whom he may devour. And so Peter gives us a little added insight. In Job, we find out that Satan is going back and forth on the earth. Peter says he's going back and forth on the earth, seeking whom he may devour. And so when God says to him, have you considered my servant Job? It falls right in line with what Job is doing, or with what Satan is doing. He is looking for someone that he can knock off of his game. A place where he can find vulnerability in that person's life and keep them from a walk of faith. Peter tells us to be sober. That doesn't mean don't drink, although that's probably not a good idea either. But he talks about having a serious mindset. I think last week was that have your game face on. We need to have our game faces on, because we do have an adversary who is looking for a way to knock you and I off of our game. That is what he is about. Now, that's not the only thing that he's about, but he certainly is about doing that very thing. We came to the end of our lesson last week, and I told you I was not going to tell you the title of this series until we got to the end of last week's lesson. Now, the cat's already out of the bag. You know what the title is. But I want you to notice what we see about Job in verse 22 of chapter 1. Because in the intervening verses there, between verse 8 and verse 22, we find that Job loses everything. That God says to Satan, you can take everything that Job has. You can touch all of that, but you can't touch him personally. And so we find that Job loses everything. Everything. Okay? How many of you have ever felt like you've lost everything? And yet, we most always have something. But Job lost everything. Okay? Except one thing.
His life and his wife.
His life and his wife, and one more thing. What was it?
His integrity.
His what?
Friend.
Okay.
Health.
What did you say?
His integrity.
His integrity.
Yes.
He did not lose his integrity. Okay? And it says, in all this, Job did not sin by charging God with wrongdoing. What do we often do when things begin to go in a way that we would call the wrong way? Okay? What kinds of thoughts begin to go through our minds? Does anybody think, what did I do?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
How, God, how have I, are you punishing me? God? Is this, I related to you last week about one of a person that I met in the last few months who has cancer. And her comment to me was, I think God has given me this cancer because of what I did earlier in my life. Now, you know, we all shake our heads at that and say, oh, well, no way, God wouldn't do that. But how many of you feel undermined to some degree when these kinds of things happen? And it can make us feel a little insecure. Don't we even, okay, let's put it on an even more mundane level. You walk into a group of people that you know are your friends, and you walk in and you say, hi, how's everybody? And for some reason on that day, the response is kind of like, yeah, hi. And the thought is, wow, what did I do? Are they mad at me? Is there something? True?
Amen.
Okay. How much more so when it comes to our relationship with God? And yet, listen to what the testimony is about Job. In all of this, he did not charge God foolishly. He did not lash out at God. And that's a remarkable thing. And we go on and we see the same thing happen in chapter 2 when God actually allows Satan to put his finger on Job's life. And so we're dealing with this issue of suffering. We're dealing with the insecurities that we feel when what we thought was a secure relationship in some way feels like it's been challenged in some kind of way. I mean, if I went home tonight and our house burned down, and I mean, just the same kind of scenario, because remember, when Job was getting the report, one guy showed up, and before he could get his story done, there was another person standing in line, waiting to tell him the next story, and then the next, and then the next. I mean, you want to talk about piling on. You can get a penalty for that in football. There was no penalty for it here. It was the reality of Job's experience. And the question is, why would God allow this to happen? Interesting point. Look at verse 16 of chapter 1. Who gets the blame for the fire that fell out of heaven on Job's children?
Oh, God.
God. Who caused it?
He did. It was his.
Satan. Satan was the cause, was he not?
Oh, the cause, yeah.
Wasn't he the one who God said, okay, you can go for it? Okay? Isn't it interesting that often we'll look at things like that and we assume that it's God's fault because it happened in such a way that we think, well, no one else could have done that. And there is this bit of finger pointing that takes place when these kinds of events occur. And it's interesting for us to note that Job does not charge God in that kind of way. And that's why I gave this the title, Judging God. Because often that is what we do. And God, if you wanted to, you could stop this.
At 9/11, the whole country blamed God.
Yeah. I'll just tell you my story. I was but I started wearing glasses when I was 10. I hated wearing glasses. I wanted to play baseball. I wanted to play sports. I had my glasses 1 week. 1 week. And I got a tether ball right here. And it just cracked the lens right down. That was the days of glass lenses. They were heavy. I was half blind. My glasses were down here all the time. It was an awful thing. I don't know how many times I was prayed for healing from that side. I don't know why. I don't know why. Okay? You could all probably recite circumstances in your life. And the issue for us at times is that okay, God, why did I get saddled with this? And why won't you do something about it? Now, certainly, in the scope of everything, there are a lot more important things going on in the universe than my eyes being healed. Okay? But it was pretty important in my universe. Okay? It was pretty important in my universe. And, you know, that's just one of those things that you say, okay, Lord, maybe someday you'll tell me the rest of the story. But I just wanted to set us up. This is what we're looking at. Why do the righteous suffer? Why is there this issue of suffering? You know, one of the things that we have to be careful of, this little enclave that took place in heaven, every test that you and I have, it's not likely that the sons of God and Satan have gathered in heaven to plan your next test. Okay? But in this case, it did take place. And so how then do we deal with this issue of suffering?